Our first speaker is Karen Snyder, who's the Executive Director of ABARES. She was appointed to that position in November 2013. In that position, she oversees the Bureau's program of work, including research and commodity analysis. Prior to that, she was the first Assistant Secretary of the Department of Agriculture's Biosecurity Animal Division, Executive Director of the Bureau of Rural Sciences, and Deputy Executive Director of ABARES. In prior experiences, Karen has spent 8 years as an analyst at the International Energy Agency at the OECD and several positions as an economist in the Australian Public Service. She holds qualification in applied science from the University of New South Wales. So to start us off this morning and to paint a picture of where the farm sector sits and what that might mean, please welcome Karen Snyder.
Thanks, Mick, for that introduction. I'm just going to try and do this with iPad rather than paper, but make sure it's set up properly. Thanks also for the opportunity to present today. Can I get this onto presentation? Oh, sorry, It's okay. I think so. Sorry. I think you've put really interesting issues on the table to discuss over the next 2 days, and I think they're ones that have very significant consequences for the future of agriculture, and from my perspective, from the role that government should play to help the sector realise the opportunities that it has. And as you mentioned, I think most of us would agree that many of those opportunities are arising because of the rapid increase in the global demand for food, especially from our Asian region. And we expect that that will provide significant scope for our producers to expand their output, their exports, and potentially their profits. But understanding the characteristics of farm businesses that are likely to drive success in that environment will obviously be important. So what I'd like to do today is provide some overall scene setting, as Mick said. I want to look at some recent trends around farm financial performance and try to identify some of the factors that are integral to better performance. So I'd like to start by addressing that age-old question in agriculture of whether the size of a farm business is a key factor to improving financial performance, or in other words, is the get big or get out mantra of previous decades still relevant? Or have we shifted from get big to get smart, or further to you have to be smart to get big? The data I'll be using are derived mainly from ABARES Farm Surveys program. Each year we survey about 2,000 farms in the broadacre and dairy industries, and in the past few years we've added about another 1,000 farms in horticulture and irrigated agriculture. So that gives us a fairly broad base from which we can draw some statistically rigorous conclusions about the overall physical and financial performance of the sector. So first to the facts around whether farms in Australia have continued to expand in size in recent years. And the short answer is yes, and they've done so according to a range of different measures. At the simplest level, the average area operated by Australian farms has grown over many years, although the rate of growth has been much slower in the period since about the early 2000s. Broadacre farms account for around 90% of agricultural land use in Australia, but we know that the same trends are true in dairy. Although the average area operated by farms has increased, the total area of land used for agriculture has contracted over the period that we've looked at here, and that's mainly because land has been converted to non-agricultural uses, things like mining and conservation and urban development. But the physical size of farms obviously doesn't tell the whole story. The economic size of farm businesses is also relevant. And to capture this, we look here at the total value of receipts generated, in this case here by the average broadacre farm. Using this measure, we can see that there's also been an upward trend in the economic size of farms over time, although with significant variation year on year. Now, a value-based measure of output like this captures a number of factors on top of the straight-out increase in the scale of production. It also captures increases in the intensity of production, or the use of more inputs such as fertiliser, land, capital, and it captures a shift to the production of higher valued outputs. Both of those factors will increase the measure of size of farm businesses. But there's obviously volatility in this measure of farm size because of variation in yields and movements in commodity prices. And you can see the impact that seasonal conditions have had on yields and output from that graph. To reduce the variation caused by prices and yields, we've constructed an alternative physical measure of farm size by expressing size in terms of sheep equivalents. It's rough, but we say that it takes about the same resources to produce 8 sheep as it does 1 head of beef cattle, and 12 sheep for 1 head of dairy cattle or 1 hectare of crops. So that allows us to convert the resource use and output of different enterprises into a common currency. And when we do this for broadacre farms, that's what it shows. Stronger growth over time than the simple physical measure of area farmed, and a less volatile trend than the economic measure of farm size. In some cases, such as on mixed livestock grains farms, that trend reflects the switch from running sheep or beef cattle to cropping, and in other cases it reflects running more sheep or cattle per hectare. When compared with the first figure that showed the average area operated hasn't increased by very much over the past decade, this tells us that intensification and changes in enterprise mix have been more significant means by which farmers have increased the size of their operations in the past 10 or so years. And that represents something of a change from previous decades when increasing farm area appears to have been a more important means of increasing farm size. This figure for the dairy industry shows that a similar trend's been happening there too. The average volume of production per farm in the dairy industry, which is the green line at the top, has grown significantly since the early 2000s, but the average area operated, which is the red one at the bottom, has increased only a little bit. Instead, the increase in production has been driven by increases in the number of cows milked per farm and in the amount of milk produced per cow, which is not something I have on that graph. For the total agricultural sector, and these figures are from ABS census data rather than from ABARES, the increase in intensity has meant that the total volume of agricultural output has increased significantly over time, even as the total number of farms and the area of land used for agriculture has declined. And part of that trend has been an increase in the concentration of agricultural output over time, or in other words, a smaller proportion of farms is producing a larger share of total output. This plots that cumulative story. It's the cumulative industry output against the cumulative population of farms ranked from largest on the left to smallest on the right. For the grains industry here, it shows that currently, which is the top line for 2013, the largest 20% of farms generate about 80% of the total value of receipts. It also shows that that extent of concentration has increased over time. You can also see that the smallest 50% of farms account for a very small proportion of total output. It's about 3% in 2013. These data are from our ABARES farm surveys, and we include all farms in that survey program that have a gross value of production of $40,000 or more. If we included only the truly commercial scale farm businesses, say those with output of above, say, 200,000, then output concentration would obviously be lower, and the smallest farms would account for more of the total value of sales, but the general pattern would be the same. If we repeat the exercise for the beef industry, this is the picture that we get. Concentration of output is higher. The largest 10% of farms account for nearly 90% of total receipts, or the value of cattle sales. That reflects, of course, the dominance of a small number of very large operations, mostly in northern Australia, that control large amounts of land and livestock. And if we looked at the dairy and sheep sectors, which I don't have here, we'd see broadly similar trends. So the overall picture is that concentration of output among the largest producers has been increasing, and is currently relatively high across a range of industries. One consequence of that trend is that industry-level performance in agriculture is increasingly being determined by the performance of the largest operators. And that's an important thing for policymakers and others interested in the future of our industries to keep in mind. But that's the overall industry picture. To understand why those trends are occurring, we need to look at the farm-level data. And when we do that, the most likely explanation for increasing farm size is simply that larger farms are typically more profitable than smaller ones. Here we have the average rate of return on capital, excluding appreciation of land use, against farm size measured by receipts for the key agricultural sectors. And it shows that on average, the smallest farms in all sectors are generating negative returns on capital, while the largest farms generate average returns of 2% or more. This only shows the average of the past 3 years, but it's a consistent story over time. Now, there are obviously lots of things at work here, including very individual factors such as land quality, but there are still some interesting general stories. For example, we can see that beef farms gain relatively little in terms of return on capital from increasing size. That's partly a reflection of poor conditions in the industry over the past 3 years, but it also reflects the relative scarcity of scale economies in livestock industries compared with dairy, grains and vegetables. And those scale economies give greater scope for mechanisation that allows larger farms to earn significantly higher returns than their smaller counterparts. In the case of vegetables, it might also reflect supply chain relationships where large producers that are able to guarantee reliable quantities and quality of produce receive a premium return. And profitability increases with farm size, even when we look at the top performing farms in each of the size categories. This is the same figure as the previous one, but it's limited to the best performers in each industry, or the top 25% of all farms ranked by rate of return. When we do this, even the top performing small farms tend to do worse than their larger counterparts. So size is still important, even among farms performing well above the average. I guess as a bit of an aside, the fact that there are a large number of small farms earning low or even negative rates of return is not necessarily an economic problem. Our data from the surveys show that on average, the operators of these farms have little debt, derive most of their household income from off-farm sources, and account for a relatively small proportion of the total area of land or other resources used in agriculture. So when thinking about Australian agriculture overall and the issues that need to be addressed to enhance performance, and that obviously includes financing, it's probably most effective to focus on the farms that account for the large majority of output and resource use. So now I want to look at what we know about how larger farms generate higher rates of return or greater profitability. And although there's a multitude of factors at work, higher productivity on larger farms is consistently important. In the case of the grains industry, this shows that on average, productivity is higher as farm size increases. And similar trends apply in livestock industries. Higher productivity means that on average, large farms derive more output from each unit of input that they use. ABARES work based again on the farm survey data has found that this mainly reflects the use of different technology and the development of more efficient production systems that this allows on larger farms. In particular, it appears that larger farms tend to use a different mix of inputs, which enables them to produce more with fewer overall resources on a unit basis. There are several reasons why larger farms might have access to different, more efficient technology than smaller ones. First, in economic terms, large farms have more to gain from investing in new technologies because the costs and impacts of the technology can be spread over a greater volume of output. That applies particularly to high-cost technologies, things such as robotic milking and feeding equipment in dairies, or advanced computer systems for water application in irrigated agriculture. It may also be the case that new technologies being developed are more suitable for larger scale operations, so that larger farms have a greater range of new technologies to choose from. Also, the managers of larger farms may have characteristics that make them more likely to adopt new technologies, or it may be that the greater size of the workforce on larger farms allows specialisation, and that this facilitates the adoption of new technologies. And a further reason relates to the greater financial capacity of large farms to borrow and invest in new technologies. Larger farms typically have more equity in absolute dollar terms and higher net cash flows than smaller farms, and they're more likely to be able to borrow to fund the purchase of new technology. And given that that point's closely related to the central theme of the conference, I thought it might be interesting to use our farm survey data to explore the relationship between farm size and debt in a bit more detail. So this figure shows that the vast majority of debt in the broadacre sector is held by the largest farms. The top 10% of farms account for more than 50% of total debt. They use this debt for a variety of purposes, including the purchase of capital items such as land and machinery, which embeds technology, as well as for working capital. And when we couple that with the farm performance data shown earlier, the concentration of debt among the largest farms suggests there's a strong correlation between the productivity and profitability of farms and their levels of debt. And that's what you'd expect to see in a well-functioning market for rural finance. There's relatively little difference in the capacity of farms to service debt across size categories. While larger farms typically have more debt, they're able to service it as well as smaller farms, reflecting their greater profitability. Although, although there's no time dimension to this graph, we know that in recent years, total agricultural debt has declined, and as interest rates have fallen, so too have debt servicing requirements. Our data suggests that the incidence of debt usually aligns with the profitability of farm sectors, reflecting both a well-functioning capital market and the fact that debt is being used productively to enhance performance. But that leaves the question of how smaller farms that have less capacity to raise debt can invest in new technologies that will enhance their productivity and profitability or expand the size of their operations. And that could mean exploring alternatives to purchasing technology using borrowed funds, such as the use of contractors, leasing, cooperative agreements with other farmers, and expanding through leasing or adjusting arrangements. And when we look at our farm performance data, the smaller farms that are performing well tend to use precisely those approaches. So I want to finish there by summarising some of the key messages that come out of the farm survey data. First of all, the trend to increasing farm size and concentration of output does continue, underpinned by intensification and changing enterprise mix. Larger farms are on average more productive and profitable than smaller farms, although there are high-performing farms in all size categories. Our research shows that an important reason for this better performance is that larger farms have access to and use more advanced technology than their smaller counterparts, which allows them to produce more output more efficiently. And that suggests a number of roles for government. One is to ensure the effective functioning of the agricultural research and development system that delivers technological advances to farmers. That will include maximising the payoffs to public investment in R&D and improving the incentives for increased private investment. And part of that will be getting the regulatory framework right around the path to market for new technologies. And a second role is to reduce impediments to high-performing enterprises obtaining more resources, be they land, capital, labour, or any other input to production. The movement of resources between expanding and contracting farms has accounted for a significant proportion of productivity growth, especially over the past 10 years or so. Facilitating that process will be key to growing the profitability of the farm sector into the future. Thank you.